Okay, thanks everyone for being here to watch this talk. My talk is called You've Got a Sinatra on Your Rails. I am José Valim, and this talk is about my outstanding Photoshop skills and my amazing naming abilities. So we will literally write some code today that will create this Rails Sinatra thing. And the goal today is to hack Rails for fun and profit. So the idea is that we are going to build some Sinatra features into Rails, using it as an excuse to understand Rails internals better, okay? So a little bit about me. I am co-founder of Plataforma Tech. We are a consultancy in Brazil. We build mission-critical software. And you probably already heard of us because of open source projects like Simple Form, which is a form DSL for Rails, Device, which is the de facto authentication solution for Rails, and Elixir, which is a programming language that runs on their Lane virtual machine. And I joined the Rails core team back in 2010. I also have two coworkers that they could not be here today from Plataforma Tech that are also on the core team, Rafael França and Carlos Antonio. I'm sending my regards to them. And this is the perspective of my talk. So since I'm on the Rails core team, it happens that I know a couple stuff about Rails internals and how it works, and that's what I want to share with you in this talk. So we're going to have a lot of code, not a lot, 150 lines, something about that. And we are going to see how Rails works, okay? So what are we going to talk about today? We are going to cover four main topics. The first one is single file Rails applications. The second one is Rack and the Rails router. The third one is middleware stacks. And the fourth one is the Rails rendering stack, okay? So let's get started. So single file Rails applications, okay? So if we use Sinatra, if you go to Sinatra website, they're going to have an example like this, okay? They're going to say, well, if you want to run your Sinatra application, what they're going to do is that they're going to create this config.ru file, requires Sinatra stuff, and then you define your Sinatra application, define the route, what this route needs to return, and then you run this application, okay? And all the code you're going to develop today in this talk is going to be in this config.ru file, okay? So what is config.ru? It's not ru because of Russia. It's because it's a rackup file, so it's rackup. So it is instructions. This file should contain instructions to how we start your rack application, right, to how you're going to start a rack application. And let's start with a very small example. So here, we can see that we are calling, this is a config.ru file, it's a rackup file. So it calls the method run, and it's passing a lambda to this run, and this lambda is supposed to be a rack application. What is a rack application? A rack application is any Ruby object that responds to the method call. So a lambda responds to call, so it is a rack application in this sense. And it receives one argument. This argument is the environment hash there at the top, env. And this environment hash contains a lot of information about the request. So all the information in the request is going to be in this environment hash. And this rack application needs to return an array with three elements, okay? The status of your response, the headers, a hash containing the headers, and the body. And the body can be any Ruby object that responds to each. So an array responds to each, we can iterate on it. So that's our rack application response, right? And this is our rackup file. So we are returning 200, which means status OK. The headers is saying that the content type is text plain, and the body is going to be hello world. Okay, so if we put this in the config.ru file, in the rackup file, we can start it, and then we can do a request on the port that this thing is going to run, and it's going to return hello world. So this thing works, okay? Rack allows us to do more complex stuff if you want in this rackup file. So besides the run method, it also has a map method. And then you can say, well, inside this map thing, all the requests starting with /hello is going to this map block, and we are going to run this hack application that returns world, but everything outside of hello is going to run this rack application here at the body that returns nothing here, right? So if we start this one, okay, if we call rackup and we access curl localhost 9292 is going to return nothing here, but if x says/hello, it's going to return world. So this is a couple of functionality that comes by default in this recup file. So now that we understand what is this config.ru recup file, let's go back to our Sinatra example. Okay? So our Sinatra example, basically what it's doing is that it's requiring Sinatra, and then we are inheriting from Sinatra base to define a class. And an instance of this class, we can see in the last line, an instance of this class is a rec application, because that's what they are passing to run. So an instance of this class is going to respond to call, and is going to receive the request, process, and send a response back, right? So that's the kind of abstraction we are working with. Okay, so we have Sinatra. In Sinatra, we can put our whole application into a single file. But can we do this with Rails? Okay, so let's try it. Okay, so let's do a little bit of reverse engineering. So the first step is if you create a Rails application since Rails tree, you can see that there is a config.ru file in there. There is a recup file in there. And this recup file contains basically 2 lines, right? The first line is requiring the file config environment. And the second line is running this application. Okay, so I created a Rails application called sample. So the first line requires the environment file, and the second line runs this Rails application as a rec application. Okay, so apparently we need to look at this environment file and see what this environment file does too. So if we open up the environment file, it contains 2 lines again, right? And what are those 2 lines? The first line requires the application file, the config application file, and the second one initializes the application. Okay. And then, okay, if the environment requires the application, let's look at the application file. The application file, we are used with it because every time you need to configure something or Rails application, you need to go to config/application, and you need to change a configuration, something of sorts, right? So this file is a little bit longer, but mostly what it's doing is that it is requiring the boot file and defining a Rails application. And the boot file, the last thing you need to look at is simply setting up bundler, right? So it works with origin file and whatnot, okay? So this is kind of how we did in reverse order, how the Rails booting process works. So now let's do it like straight, right? So when you boot a Rails application, the first thing that's going to happen is that we are going to the config boot file, and the responsibility of this file, all this file does, is to set up the load path. So in this case, use bundler, because bundler is going to get the things that are in your gem file. It's going to check if everything is there, okay? And then we go to the application file. The application file is basically going to define the application. This is where you inherit from Rails application, and you can configure your application. And then we go to the environment file that initializes the application. So the environment file is when things actually start to happen, because that's when we are going to connect to the database and we start loading code, okay? And finally, we end up on the config.recup file, which is going to set up rec. So that's how the process works. And then you can say, well, isn't that like too many files? You need like 4 files to boot Rails? Why it's so broken apart, right? And we actually have a good reason for this. It's because different parts of Rails, they need to hook at different points in the initialization process. So in the new Rails application, you can also see that we have a rake file, okay, to run your rake tasks. And what this rake file does, it requires the application and load the application tasks. So you can see here that different from the recup file, it's loading the application file and not the environment file. And why is that? Because in order, for example, when you run like rake -t to show all the rake tasks available, you don't need to initialize application. You don't need to configure to the database, right? So we just load the application file. We don't need to initialize everything, and then you can have fast feedback. When you type rake -t, we're going to show the result fast, and there are a bunch of other tasks that use exactly this idea that we don't need to initialize Rails to run something. However, on the other hand, there are a bunch of tasks like rake db migrate. It needs to connect to the database to migrate your code, right? Your own application has a bunch of tasks that need to connect to the model and do something. And what do we do in those cases, right? So when we first learned Rails, we wrote our first rake task. The book told us, or the tutorial told us, you need to depend on this environment task, right? And what does environment task does? It requires the config environment file. So we initialize our application, right? So that's why it's broken apart. So we can hook at different points, and we can have like some fast rake tasks because you don't need to initialize everything. So with this in mind, okay, let's see how a single file Rails application looks like, okay? So let's flip here. So I was thinking about live coding, but it's going to be too painful for you to watch me type and whatnot. So I have it ready, and I'm going to show you exactly how it works, okay? So the first line, so here's our single file Rails application. It contains about like 27 lines of code. And the way it works is that the first 2 lines here is the equivalent of the boot file. All we are doing here is setting up the load paths. In this case, you're using Ruby gems to make everything available, okay? And then those 4 lines, next 4 lines here, is the beginning of the config application file. So if you go into a Rails application, you probably have something like require Rails all. Except here, we don't want to require all. So what we did is that we required just the things we needed. We required Rails, active support, and actual controller. We are not going to connect to the database, so we don't need active record. We're not going to send an email, so we don't need actual mailer. So I'm not requiring those. I'm explicitly picking what I want, okay? And then we can see here that we define our single file Rails application. So we are inheriting from Rails application, as you see in your regular applications, right? And we are setting up the production configuration. So we're setting eager load to true, and you're setting cache class to true. And this is Rails 4, okay? So this is running Rails 4. So you can see here that we also have a config secret key base. So in Rails 4, we don't have the cook secret anymore. We have the secret key base, which is more of a general thing. And this is a configuration. We need to set it. If we don't set it, Rails is not going to boot. We need to set the secret. So I put some random value in here. And then I define a basic route, and this basic route, we can see here that it is pointing to a rack application, so it's going to return hello world. And then here at line 24 is the end of our config application, and this line 25, we initialize it, which is what the environment file does, and then we finally run this application, okay? So here's a single file Rails application, okay? So does it work, right? Does it actually work? So let's give it a try. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to do recap config.ru, and it's going to boot up the single file Rails application, okay? And then I'm going to do a request, and it returns hello world, so it works. Single file Rails application. Nice. So excellent. It works. We can put everything in a single file like Sinatra, right? What are you going to use it for? Nothing. Yay. So I'm kidding. Actually, there are like some good use cases for it. So first one is that if you put everything into a file, it makes it easier for you to understand how Rails booting works. So it has like an education purpose, right? Another good example of how you can use it is that if you have a gem that depends on a Rails application running, you can put the whole Rails application into the single file and have it running your tasks. Another good case that there is a bug in your Rails application and you want to submit an issue report, you can put everything into a single file with your controllers and send it to us into a gist, and it's much easier than pushing a whole application to GitHub, right? So there are some use cases, but I wouldn't use it in production, okay? Nice. So that was the first part of the talk. We are done with it. Single file Rails application, it works wonderful. So let's talk now about rack and the Rails router. So in this example, the single file Rails application I just showed you, we have this in our routes. We had this thing like root to, and here what we were passing to the route was a rack application again. So it's a lambda. It receives one argument, which is called env, and the env receives is a hash with the request information, and it returns an array with 3 elements: the static code, the headers, and the body. Okay, and everything in the Rails router, it works with rack applications. So this code is the equivalent to this code, right? We simply transform root into a get at the root route, okay? And every time you're saying like get, post, put, delete, you're always using rack applications underneath. So you can say, well, if you're always using rack applications, when I write a code like this, how does it become a rack application, right? So here we have a route pointing to the post controller action index. And internally, when Rails sees this string, what Rails does is that it converts it to this. It converts to post controller dot action passing the action name, right? And this is going to return the action, that action for that controller as a rack application, okay? So with this in mind, we are ready to write Rails Sinatra and have Rails Sinatra working, okay? So I want to show you that. So let's go back to TextMate, and there's a config.ru file here. And here is already using Rails Sinatra. And first I'm going to show you how Rails Sinatra works, and then you're going to see its implementation, okay? So the first lines are pretty much the same. The first difference here starts at line 9, where we require the Rails Sinatra file, which is where there's the Rails Sinatra implementation. And here is our first Rails Sinatra endpoint, okay? So what we can see here is that we are inheriting from Rails Sinatra, right? We are defining our own endpoint, and we are defining routes Sinatra style, right? So we can say get, do this, right? We can say put, post, delete. We can say whatever we want. And then, however, when you want to render the template, we are using the Rails render DSL, right? So it's like really Rails Sinatra. We have like both of them in there. And this is great. And we can see here that those lines are the first change we did. And then we did just one extra change, is that we replaced the root route by this mount call. Let me put it at the top. By this mount call here, right? So those are the two changes we did. And and before I show it working, let's see the Rails Sinatra implementation, how it looks like. So Rails Sinatra is about 75 lines of code. And basically, the way it works is this. So the first lines, it's requiring our dependencies, so it's action controller base. And you can see here that Rails Sinatra is built on top of action controller base. So it's going to get everything Rails gives. It's going to give us rendering, layouts, and everything that you have in a regular controller. It's already available in Rails Sinatra. This is good, right? And then the first thing we do is that we define this inline routes attribute, which is where we're going to store our routes, okay? So when we say something like this, get foo do in our Rails Sinatra, basically what it's doing is that it is storing this route, this information into this hash, which you can see here on line 15, okay? So I'm going through this a little bit quick, but the code's going to be all online later, and then you can check and you can play with it yourselves. So basically what we're doing is that every time you call get, post, put, delete, we are storing this information in this hash, okay? And here we define the main methods, right? Like get, post, put, delete, patch, they're all defined here. And all they do is to define a route. And this route is stored in the hash, okay? So this is the bulk of our DSL. And then the next thing we do is that we define a call method. Why do we do that? If we go back to the rackup file, we can see here that we are calling mount endpoint, right? So it means that this endpoint is a rack application. And if it is a rack application, it needs to respond to call, right? So that's what we did here. We defined a call method in our endpoint, right, in Rails Sinatra. And what this call method does is that it gets the Rails Sinatra action and call it. So I could have written something like this, endpoint or action Rails Sinatra, right? But, well, let's just write this because it's a little bit more elegant. And then we have the shortcut here. And then the Rails Sinatra action is simply going to try to find the route that matches. So if we find a route, great, we are going to execute it. If it's not, we are going to return not found. Okay, so that's the bulk of Rails Sinatra. So let's run it, okay? So we see here that we have the endpoints mounted at hello. We are matching on the road route, okay? So it means that if I start this backup, if I start this file, we should get Rails Sinatra working. So it booted, and then I can do localhost, hello, road, and sprint it. Yeah, Rails Sinatra. So woo, it's working. So here we have Rails Sinatra working, excellent. And there is something very interesting about this, is that the request we are doing is, if we look here, is /hello/world. But on the other hand, the Rails Sinatra endpoint is matching just on /world, right? So how does this thing actually work? How this route is actually matching, okay? So that's what we're going to talk now. So what happens that every time you're in the Rails router, you use methods like get, post, put, delete, okay? What this does, that underneath it uses the match, right? And what match does is that it matches on the full path. So when you say get/hello, you need to receive exactly a /hello request for this route to match. But in this example, we use something else. We used mount. And what mount does is that it matches just on the path prefix. So if you say mount something at hello, all URLs starting with hello, right? They don't need to match completely. If they just start with hello, they are going to be forwarded to the rec application you pass to mount, okay? And the way it works is like this. So I was talking like, we have rec applications, and rec applications receives an environment as first argument. And this environment contains request information. And two of these information that we have in the environment hash is one is the path info, and the second one is the script name, okay? So when you send a request like /hello/road, the web server, like thing, is going to get this request, is going to get the route /hello/road, and is going to put it in the path info, okay? So it gets the path from the request and is putting it inside this hash thing. And then this request is going and is going to reach the Rails router. It's still as /hello/road, but then Rails Sinatra is going to see, the Rails router is going to see, well, I have this mount thing, right? It's going to the Rails Sinatra endpoint. So what it does is that it breaks it apart. Since it's a mount thing, it's getting the hello from the path info, moving it to the script name, and setting the path info to /road. So what happens is that from the Rails Sinatra perspective, it's receiving like a request to /road. It doesn't care about the /hello, and that's why it works, okay? And this is a thing that is in the rec specification, so that's why today, if you want, you can actually get the real actual Sinatra and put it inside your Rails router and mount it inside your Rails router, and that's going to work because they all follow this, okay? So that's it about the second part of the talk, rec and the Rails router. We learned about, the rec API. So rec API, we're talking about rec applications and how they respond to call. We need to receive an environment hash and return an array. We talk about post-control action index, so how the Rails router is using rec underneath. And we talked about match versus mount, right? Match is going to match on the whole thing, and mount is going to match just on the prefix. Excellent. So now is the third part of the talk, so middleware stacks, okay? So in a way or the other, you've manipulated or played with Rails middleware stack, okay? So I was talking about device at the beginning of the talk, which is an authentication solution for Rails. And if you use device, at some point, it's calling a line like this, config.middleware.use warden. And what this line is doing is that it's setting up a middleware that's responsible to do the rec authentication thing. And what this means is that it's doing something like this. So every time you have a request in a Rails application, you have a Rails application, and then there's a request. This request passes through a bunch of middlewares, right, until this request gets to the Rails router. And then the Rails router is going to send this request somewhere, and then it becomes a response, like the controller renders something, and then you have a response that goes back through the router and through all the middleware, right? So what is happening here is that the middleware, it receives the request, it can manipulate the request if it wants when it's going, and it can also manipulate the response when it's going back. And when you say config.middleware.use, basically what you're doing is that you're inserting this middleware in the middle of Rails application middleware stack, okay? So this is how middleware works and how they can manipulate the request and the response. You're going to see with more detail soon. And what is actually, so this middleware stack is very well like widespread. If you go to Rails documentation, we talk about it. What we don't talk about a lot is that a regular Rails request actually passes through at least 3 middleware stacks, right? So if you have a request that goes to a control and action, it's going to pass through at least 3 middleware stacks. So the first one is the one contained by the web server. So when we start the web server-like thing, it's going to have its own middleware stack. So it passes through one middleware, another middleware, and then it reaches the Rails application, okay? And then the Rails application has its own middleware stack too. And those middleware stacks, they're like configuring cookies, configuring section, connection to the database until it gets to the router. And then when it gets in the router is going to send a request to somewhere, like to a controller, and then the controller has its own middleware stack too before it gets to an action, and then in the action it renders something and sends the response back, okay? So we have 3 middleware stacks here. And if we have a middleware stack in the controller, it means that Rails Sinatra has a middleware stack also, because Rails Sinatra is a controller, right? So it probably has a middleware stack too. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to show you exactly how to hook up now into those 3 middleware stacks. So let's take a look at it. So what I'm going to do now is that I'm coming to this file, and then I'm going to define a middleware. So I'm going to say logger middleware. And a middleware, it receives on initialization an app. The application it needs to call next in the stack. And in our case, it's going to receive a message too. So it receives a message, and then we're going to store those. And the middleware is also a rack application. So it needs to respond to call. It's going to receive the environment, okay? And what it needs to do is that it needs to call the underlying application, rack application. So this is a very simple middleware. We just need to add the login now. And our login is going to be basically something like this. Request, message, and then, so when there is a request, we are going to print the message we received. And when there is a response, we are going to print the message again, okay? So here's our middleware definition. Basically, when there is a request, it prints something. When there is a response, it prints something too, okay? And so now let's hook this middleware, those different stacks. So the first stack is the one in the web server that sits before the Rails application. So here's where is the first middleware stack. And what you're going to do is that we're going to say use logger middleware. So every time you want to use a middleware, the rack naming for this is use. So we are going to call use everywhere. So use logger middleware, and the message is going to be one web server. This is our first middleware stack, okay? And then if the second middleware stack is inside the Rails application, so what you're going to do here is that we're going to say config middleware use, and then you're going to use the logger middleware, and you're going to say two is the Rails app stack, is the second middleware stack. And then finally, our third middleware stack is inside Rails Sinatra. So we're going to say use logger middleware, and 3 Rails Sinatra, okay? I hope it works. So we got the logger middleware. We are going to put it in those 3 different middleware stacks. So let's see if it works. So I will restart this application. Dun, 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 dun. And I will do a new request to Rails Sinatra. And we can see here that it's showing exactly what we wanted to log, right? So there is a request. So there is a request. It's going to pass through the first middleware stack, which is the web server one. And then it reaches the Rails application. And then it goes to Rails Sinatra. And then Rails Sinatra is going to calculate the response and send it back. So when you send it back, it does the opposite way, right? It's going through Rails Sinatra, and then the Rails application, and then it goes back to the web server. So that's how middleware and middleware stacks work, right? And this is great because we didn't actually have to write a single line of code, right? We got the whole middleware stack for free because we are building things on top of the Rails controller. And this is one of the things we got for free. So we got the middleware stack for free, but we also get before and after action hooks, right? Those came for free too. You can call before filter in Rails Sinatra, and it's just going to work. We also get streaming for free that we have in Rails 4. So it's there. You can just use it. We get layouts. We get rendering. So we're getting a lot of stuff for free to Rails. So our Rails Sinatra is actually quite powerful. If you want, we can actually do a lot of stuff with it. This is great. And so we finished about middleware stacks, and we are coming to the last part of the talk, which is about the rendering stack. So I want to talk about Rails rendering stack. And in order to talk about Rails rendering stack, we are going to implement one last feature that exists in Sinatra, okay? Let's take a look at this feature. So in Sinatra, what we can do is that when we define the Sinatra application, we can define a method called hello, for example. And when you render a template, you can call this hello method, okay? And the way Sinatra works is that when you render a template, this template is rendered inside your Sinatra application. Okay? It's rendered there inside. So all the instance variables, all the methods in the Sinatra application, it's available in your Sinatra templates. It's available in your Sinatra views. Okay? And in Rails is different, right? Rails has this controller thing and this view thing. And every time you want to render something in the view, for example, if you have a method in your controller and you want to make this method available to the view, you need to define it as a helper, because Rails needs to copy this helper here from the controller and make it available to the view. So it's like two separate entities, right? And then it needs to copy the instance variables and whatnot. So in Sinatra, they're the same thing. Where you render the template is where the request is also processed, okay? And what this means is that we want to do exactly like Sinatra, right? So Rails Sinatra, we want it to behave exactly like Sinatra. In order to do that, I want to describe how the Rails rendering stacks work and evolve throughout time, okay? So if we think about like a long time ago, let's say that we have like Rails 0 dot something, okay? What we had is that we had the controller, and when the controller wanted to render something, it was going to action view base and say, hey, I wanted to render this thing, right? And then action view base was going to do a bunch of stuff and give the template contents rendered back, okay? And between, of all the things action view base had to do, it had to track details. What is a detail? Detail is a relevant information to find a template. So for example, in Rails, if your request is in the JSON format, you're going to render the JSON template. If your request is in the HTML format, you're going to render the HTML template. So it means that the request format is a detail because depending on the request format, we are going to render something different, okay? So action view base need to track those details. It needs to actually go into the file system and find the template. It needs to, after those templates are found, we need to compile those templates. And then those templates are compiled, we can finally render them. And finally, action view base is the rendering context. So when you render the template, it's executed inside action view base. So it has a bunch of responsibilities, right? And it happened that throughout time, we were splitting those responsibilities apart. So about like Rails 1.0, the first thing we split it apart was the template handler, okay? So, and the template handler removed the responsibility of compiling templates from action view base to the template handler. And why this is good? Because if you have an object that does just one thing, it's very easy for you to replace it. And this extraction allows us to have stuff like Hemo, ERB, Builder, because if you want to compile a different template, you just create a template handler for that. And then we can, Rails knows now how to compile different templates. You just need to tell it how to, okay? And we continue in this process of splitting things apart. So in Rails 2.2, we removed more things from action view base. We created this view paths thing. And what a view path does is that it has the responsibility of holding file system paths and finding templates. So before Rails 2.2, you could only render templates in app/views. That was the only place we would be able to render template. With view paths, you could render template from app/views and lib/views. You could put them in different places, okay? So we continue extracting things apart, and then when Rails 3 came out, we actually did a bunch more of those extractions. So the first thing is that we added these view paths, but we can see that it has two responsibilities still. So the first thing is that we split view paths in two. So what we did in Rails 3 is that the view paths, the only thing it does now, it's like an array. It just holds resolvers. And resolvers are responsible for finding templates. What this means that we have one object that has the logic of finding templates. So it means that it's very easy to replace this object. So in Rails 3, if you want, you can actually replace the Rails default resolver, which finds the templates in the file system, and you can exchange it for something that searches for templates in the database, right? And then you can have your templates retrieved from the database because we broke it apart and we have this resolver thing, right? Another thing, so resolver was very interesting because templates no longer need to be in the file system. They can be anywhere you want. You just need to teach Rails how to look up for this stuff, okay? Another thing that we did is that we created something called lookup context, which has the responsible for tracking details, right? So you can see here that action view base is shrinking more and more, right? So what is happening here is that the responsibility of tracking like the request format and no information related to rendering a template is now in this lookup context thing. And finally, in Rails 3.1, we did the last thing. So action view base just has two responsibilities now. So what we did is that we broke it in two. So we introduced this thing called action view rendered, which is actually responsible for rendering the template. And the only thing action view base is now is that it is the rendering context. It is where your templates are rendered, which means that since all the responsibilities, they are split apart, if we want to render template somewhere different, which in this case we want to render template inside Rails Sinatra, we just need to replace action view base, okay? We just need to replace this guy because it just has one responsibility now, and that's like the important thing here. If you break things apart and make them have like small responsibilities, it's very easy for you to replace them. So let's do it, right? Let's see how these things work, okay? So this is the last code sample. What we're going to do here is that we're going to open up our last version of the recap file. And you can see that we are still requiring Rails Sinatra. And the first thing we do in Rails Sinatra now is that we are adding a new view path. We are telling Rails, I want you to render templates from the views directory that is in the same place as this application. So I want you to find templates in the views directory. We changed our route to render the template sample, okay? And we defined a method here at the bottom called hi that simply returns oh hi, okay? And if we open up the sample template, all it has is say hi. Okay, so here we are seeing that the template is invoking a method from Rails Sinatra, and we did not define it as a helper nor anything, right? Because we want the template to be rendered inside Rails Sinatra. And how we can make it work? How we can tell Rails Sinatra to work like Sinatra? Actually, we just need those 7 lines of code, right? So the first thing we do is that if we want something to behave as an action view context, we just need to include this module, action view context, and now we can render templates inside it, right? And if you go to action view context documentation, it's going to say, well, if you want this thing to be a context, before you render the template, you need to call this prepare context method. So we are calling it in a before filter, which is going to call it automatically for us. So this prepares our Rails Sinatra thing, our Rails controller. This would work with a regular Rails controller too. So this prepares our controller to be a view context. So the last thing we need to do is exactly to tell that the view context, the place where we want to render the templates, is self, right? Is the controller itself, okay? So let's see if it works. So if we come here and we start the last recap file, okay? And then if we access localhost hello world, it's returning say, oh, hi, right? And in order for you to really trust me, if you don't believe me, let's change this for something else, okay? And then we don't have reloading here, so it needs to be, we need to kill and start it again. And it returns, say, something else. So we can see that we are changing something in the controller. We didn't define it as a helper, and it's changing the view because the view is actually rendered inside the controller, okay? So to sum it up, we talked about 4 things today. We talked about single file Rails applications, and this was useful because we could, if we put everything into a single file, it's much easier to understand how Rails actually boots, right? And how it works. Then we talk about rack and the Rails router and how Rails uses a rack to do routing, and Rails relies a lot and integrates very well with rack. Then we talk about middleware stacks. Okay, so in a regular Rails request to an action, a controller, we pass through at least 3 middleware stacks, and I showed you how we can change them or how we can hook on them. And finally, we talk about Rails rendering stack, and we customize it slightly to change the view context. But we could change other things. We could add a new template handler. We could look up templates from the database. We can really customize it, okay? So this is what I wanted to tell you today, to show you today, and the idea was exactly to have something fun so we can talk about how Rails works internally. I'm going to put this code online shortly after. And I wanted to do an announcement. So about 2 years ago, I wrote this book called Crafting Rails Applications, which talks exactly about those things. But don't go buy it now, because we are going to launch the second edition of the book Wednesday, in 2 days. So the second edition of the book, we talk about a couple of things we talk in this talk, like single firewalls application, we talk about streaming, we talk about thread safety. So we are going to, and if you haven't read the first edition, in the first edition we talk how to customize Rails to look up templates for the database. So a bunch of stuff I said here, you can customize. I tell you exactly how to do it in the book. And that's it. So follow me on Twitter for updates on the slides and the code. I'm going to put it in like 30 minutes or something. And thank you very much.